The move happened quietly, like the last leaf falling from a tree in October. No fuss, no long farewells. John and I loaded the boxes into the old pickup and left the city that had been our anchor for so long. The road to the lake was winding, strewn with whispering shadows of pine trees. Every turn unveiled a new view until finally the shimmering water flickered outside the window. The house stood on a hill, modest yet sturdy, its shutters adorned with cracked paint and offering a tempting view of the lake's smooth surface. This place felt foreign to me, yet it promised a strange solace. Life in the wilderness was supposed to be a remedy for the hectic days filled with spreadsheets and calls. But within the first few days, I realized this place held not only silence, but also an inexplicable emptiness. John, as usual, was absorbed in his expeditions, leaving me alone with the house and the lake. My days passed slowly. Mornings began with walks along the shore, when a light mist hung over the water like a translucent veil. Then I turned to working on an old boat I had found at a nearby pier. Its battered hull, covered in cracks and moss, called out to me like a challenge. For hours, I sanded it down, stripped off old paint, listening to the radio whispering songs about how time waits for no one. One morning, while jogging along the trail that ran near the forest, something peculiar caught my eye. A boathouse, seemingly forgotten by time itself, stood in the distance, engulfed by tall grass. I stopped, feeling a faint thrill. Its stone walls were covered in greenery, and the roof had partially collapsed. For some reason, I stepped closer and then another step. Glass crunched underfoot, and I froze. Inside, beyond the worn wooden threshold, lay scattered nets, old oars, and half-rotted crates. The air smelled of dampness and something sweet, evoking a strange feeling, as though the scent knew more about this place's past than I could ever imagine. I didn't want to leave, but my intuition told me it wasn't time yet. I turned back, feeling a light breeze brush my shoulders, as if whispering, "Come back." Back at the house, I brewed some coffee and settled on the porch, gazing at the tranquil lake. The waves lazily lapped at the shore. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It was something else. Anticipation. The evening was strangely warm for late October. I was preparing dinner over an open flame, thick slices of bread with rosemary and butter that carried the scent of wild meadows. The fire danced before me and sparks rose into the sky, dissolving into the deepening darkness. It seemed nothing could disturb this quiet ritual until the sound of footsteps on the gravel path broke the stillness. I lifted my head. Standing at the threshold was a young man with a suitcase and a box in his hands. Dark hair, slightly tousled by the wind, and a gaze that blended shyness with exhaustion. He smiled slowly, as though afraid he might be turned away. "Aunt Caitlin?" he said, tilting his head uncertainly, as if confirming he was in the right place. His voice was soft, but there was a firmness in it that I guessed he'd inherited from John. Michael. I recalled John mentioning his nephew, who had recently finished work on some scientific project, but no one had warned me he was planning to visit. "Michael?" I asked, trying to mask my surprise. "Where did you come from?" "The canals," he replied briefly, nodding toward the lake. "It's a long story, but in short, I got lost, then found my way." He raised the box. "These are pies. Straight from the village. I hope they'll do instead of an invitation." I laughed. His presence was unexpected, but not unwelcome. He stood there in a dark jacket, barefoot in boat shoes, his whole demeanor speaking of a long and not entirely planned journey. "Come in," I gestured. "Dinner's not ready yet, but the fire will warm you." We ate sitting on low chairs by the fire. He told me how he'd reached the lake by canoe, lost his map, then stumbled upon a small village where he bought the pies. His stories were so vivid that I found myself smiling, feeling as if, for the first time in a long while, someone had looked into my life and truly seen it. Not just the scenery around it. "And you?" he asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on me. "How did you end up here? John said you two were looking for something new, but I can't imagine you away from the city." The question caught me off guard. I averted my eyes, watching the embers slowly turn gray with ash. The city, I repeated, as if tasting the word. It drained me. Every day felt the same as the one before. I thought I could breathe again here. He nodded but didn't press further, sensing perhaps that I wasn't ready for a long explanation. Instead, he offered, "Tomorrow, I'll help you with the boat. John mentioned you're trying to restore it. Let's do it together." I nodded, surprised at how easily I agreed. That evening, warm, filled with the scent of fire and pies, with his quiet voice and easy laughter, felt like something new yet strangely right. The morning started early. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm, golden patches on the floor. When I stepped onto the porch, Michael was already by the boat, studying it as if it were a complex piece of machinery. He looked focused, a faint smile on his face that seemed to say, "I'm intrigued." "Good morning," I greeted, feeling an unusual surge of energy within me. "Already figured out where to start?" "It really is a good morning," he replied, nodding toward the lake. The water was as smooth as glass, mirroring the clouds above. "As for this beauty, I think we should start with the engine. It looks neglected." We got to work. The first few hours passed in silence. He worked on disassembling the engine while I focused on the hull. Occasionally, we exchanged brief comments, but gradually the work turned less quiet. Michael began sharing bits about himself, how he had recently finished his bioengineering project, but to his surprise felt no sense of fulfillment. "Have you ever felt that?" he asked, struggling to loosen a stubborn propeller bolt. "When you finally achieve a goal you've worked toward for so long, but all you feel is emptiness?" "All the time," I replied without hesitation. "I spent 10 years climbing the corporate ladder, only to sit in an office with a view of the city and wonder why none of it made me happy." He paused, looking up at me with a gaze so direct it felt like he was seeing me for the first time. "Is that why you're here?" I nodded. We returned to work, but the conversation continued. I told him about my passion for cooking, which had always taken a back seat to my hectic schedule. He, in turn, confessed his love for cooking, particularly with fresh ingredients. His favorite dish, he said, was a mushroom cream soup he'd once made for his university friends using mushrooms he'd gathered that morning. "Sounds like a challenge," I said, smiling. "There are plenty of mushrooms around here if you know where to look. We could try making something over the fire." "Deal," he said, wiping oil from his hands. "But fair warning, I'm a perfectionist. If we're cooking, it's going to be done right." By lunchtime, we'd nearly finished repairing the engine. The boat seemed to come alive under our hands. Yet I couldn't ignore the sense of meaning that talking with Michael brought to the day. It felt like rediscovering a long-lost joy, conversation without pretense. After a quick snack, we headed into the forest, armed with knives and baskets. Sunbeams filtered through the dense canopy, and the air was rich with the scent of moss and damp earth. Michael proved to be an excellent guide, confidently identifying edible mushrooms and herbs. He recounted how his grandfather had taught him this skill, and the story carried a poignant warmth. When our baskets were full, we returned to the house. That evening, as we lit the fire, I noticed Michael watching me, his smile free of tension, filled only with warmth. "You're easy to be around," he said suddenly, tossing a branch into the flames. "It feels like coming home." I didn't reply, but something stirred within me. The day, filled with work, conversation, and quiet laughter, felt profoundly real. And I realized that in Michael's presence, I felt more alive than I had in years. The water was utterly still, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. The boat gleamed under the sun, freshly painted and outfitted with the new parts we had installed over the past few days. It was a moment of triumph, and I suggested we test it immediately. "For the first time in years, it'll glide across the water again," I said, pride evident as I admired our handiwork. Michael smirked, giving the boat a push from the shore before hopping in. "Let's just hope it doesn't drown us," he joked. The engine roared to life on the first try, its sound rough but confident. We eased away from the shore. The lake enveloped us in its silence, broken only by the gentle splashes of water trailing the stern. Michael stood at the helm, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt such a rush of freedom. "Where to?" he asked. "To the far side. There's a secluded cove. It should be beautiful." At first, everything went smoothly. We laughed, talked about our masterpiece of restoration, and I shared stories about life by the lake. But about half an hour in, the calm gave way to unease. The water around us suddenly grew shallow. Michael straightened with a furrowed brow, steering with heightened focus. But it was too late. A sudden jolt beneath the hull made us both grab onto the sides. "Looks like we're grounded," he said, cutting the engine. "What now?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "We'll have to push it free manually." He kicked off his sneakers and jumped into the water. "Hold onto the boat so it doesn't tip." I watched as he, waist deep in the lake, tried to push the vessel forward. But the current was stronger than we anticipated. The boat started to tilt, and in trying to steady it, I slipped. The next moment, icy water engulfed me like a cold curtain. "Caitlin!" Michael shouted, rushing to my side. "Are you okay?" Coughing, I managed to stand up. The water was shallow, but the shock of the cold and the impact on the lake bed left me momentarily frozen. Michael extended a hand, helping me back into the boat. His face was tense, but his eyes held something more than just worry. "Well, now we can say the boat's officially tested." I exhaled, a laugh escaping despite my exhaustion. Michael laughed too, brushing water from his face. His laughter was contagious, and soon we were both sitting there, drenched but unable to stop laughing. When he finally quieted, his gaze lingered on me a moment longer than it should have. That moment held something undefinable. Gratitude, admiration, or maybe something deeper. I felt heat rising to my cheeks and quickly turned away, focusing on the lake. "I think that's enough adventure for one day," I muttered, trying to regain my usual tone. "You're probably right," he said softly. But his voice carried something new, as if this day had changed more than just the state of the boat. It had shifted something between us. That evening, as the house was wrapped in velvet darkness, Michael unexpectedly knocked on the door of my workshop. I had just finished organizing my tools after another round of work on the boat and was about to pour myself a cup of tea. "Do you have a flashlight?" he asked, pulling a jacket over his shoulders. He held a camera in his hands. "I want to show you something. It'll take a couple of hours, no more." "Michael, we've been soaked and hauling the boat all day. Are you sure you want to go somewhere?" "Absolutely. Trust me, you won't regret it." His eyes sparkled with childlike excitement. I hadn't had such spontaneous moments in my life for a while. No plans, no schedules, just a whim. I agreed. We grabbed flashlights, a thermos of coffee, and headed into the woods. The darkness here was nothing like the city. It embraced you, surrounded you, and made you look inward. The forest was alive with its own rhythm. Rustling leaves, the whisper of the wind, the calls of nocturnal birds. We walked in silence, but there was no tension. It melted into the primal stillness around us. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "There's a spot I noticed earlier," he said without turning around. "It's where fireflies dance and the stars reflect on the water. It's perfect for night photography." When we stepped onto a small clearing by the lake, I gasped. Hundreds of fireflies were swirling around us, their soft green light resembling tiny fairies dancing in the dark. The lake was calm, and its surface mirrored the stars, creating the illusion that the sky had fallen to earth. "This is unreal," I whispered, afraid to break the magic of the moment. "That's why I wanted you to see it," he replied, pulling out his camera. "Now, watch." He began explaining how his photography worked. Long exposures, finding the perfect angle, playing with light. His voice was confident but hushed, as if he were speaking to the night itself, not just me. I watched as he adjusted his camera with meticulous focus, capturing fireflies in his frame. His concentration was almost enchanting. This really captures you, doesn't it? I asked, observing how his face lit up in the beam of his flashlight. More than anything, he admitted without looking away from the viewfinder. Every photograph is more than just an image. It's a moment that will never come again. His words resonated with me. I thought about how, in the city, I had been endlessly chasing something intangible, missing moments that could have mattered. Standing here, surrounded by light and water, I felt my heart slow down, filling with something new. "You're not just photographing stars," I said as he finished. "You're collecting them." He turned, his eyes shining, not from the light, but something else, warm and soft. Maybe I'm trying to collect something bigger. His words lingered in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. We sat on the shore, drinking coffee from the thermos and watching the fireflies gradually vanish into the darkness. I found myself wanting to know more about him. What he thought, what he felt, what had brought him here, to me. This man, with his childlike enthusiasm and adult wisdom, felt more genuine than anyone I had met in a long time. The night, cold and deep, wrapped us in its vastness, leaving only the two of us under the starry sky. The next day, we set out to the nearby village for supplies. Narrow streets, the smell of fresh bread, and the muted chatter of elderly women by a vegetable stall created an atmosphere of unhurried simplicity. Michael was enchanted, as if he had stepped into a world he had only read about in books. "It feels like time has stopped here," he said, watching an old man slowly adjust the sign on a tiny workshop. "Maybe it has," I replied, "and there's a certain charm in that." After picking up what we needed, we headed to a riverside cafe, where small wooden tables sat beneath the trees. That's where we met him. A stranger, an old man in a battered straw hat with eyes that seemed to carry a lifetime of stories. He sat at a nearby table, sipping coffee and gazing into the distance, as if he saw not just the river, but something beyond it. "Beautiful spot," Michael said, almost casually. "Beautiful," the old man agreed, his gaze unwavering. "But beauty can sometimes come at a high price." Michael gave him a curious look, and I, sensing the conversation might become interesting, chose not to interrupt. "Where are you from?" Michael asked. "Not local, am I right?" The old man chuckled, his smile warm but tinged with sadness. "I've been many places. The sea called to me, like the sun calls to the horizon. I left my family, everything I knew, to chase the dream of building a yacht and seeing the world." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "And I did. But when I returned, I realized I'd lost what truly mattered." His words lingered in the air. For a moment, his gaze rested on Michael, as if trying to impart something deeper than the story itself. "And you," the old man continued, unprompted, "have you ever thought about the cost of your freedom?" Michael fell silent. It wasn't just silence. It was introspection, a retreat into his thoughts. I could see his expression darken as he grappled with the old man's words. We thanked the stranger, leaving him to his musings, and returned to the boat. Later that evening, as we sat by the fire, Michael spoke up. "I keep thinking about that old man. His story. He's right, you know? Sometimes we chase our dreams so hard that we forget what we leave behind." "Have you left something behind?" I asked gently. He stared into the flames, his face shadowed by thought. "Maybe. I was so consumed by my project that I barely noticed anything else. The people who tried to be part of my life, the moments I let slip away. And now that it's finished, I realize how distant I was." He paused, then added quietly, "What if I'm still running, Caitlin?" His words struck a chord deep within me. His honesty was both painful and moving. I reached out and placed my hand over his, giving it a light squeeze. He looked up at me, his eyes searching mine. "You're not alone," I said, feeling the words emerge from some profound place of understanding. "Sometimes all it takes is to stop and see who's standing beside you." His fingers gently pressed against mine, and in that small gesture there was more than gratitude. It was a moment when we both realized that we weren't just in the same place. We were starting, Michael suggested visiting an abandoned lighthouse. He'd heard about it from a local fisherman. The place was hard to reach, but lured us with its mystery. According to the fisherman, no one had been there in years, and inside there might still be old things left behind, each with its own story to tell. The journey to the lighthouse turned into an adventure. We pushed through overgrown trails, navigated along cliffs where waves crashed against the rocks below. The air was thick with the scent of salt and dampness. When the lighthouse finally came into view, it looked like it belonged to another time. Tall, weathered with cracks and lichens, its windows shattered and the metal staircase rusted. "Impressive," Michael said, taking in the sight. "Sad, though, that places like this get abandoned." We stepped inside. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and aged wood. Michael began exploring the rooms, snapping photos, while I cautiously climbed the creaky spiral staircase to the top level. "It's like time stopped here," I called out, looking around the small room at the top. "The perfect place for inspiration," he replied, already standing beside me, his camera poised. Michael noticed an old chest in the corner. Together, we pried it open and found a stack of letters, yellowed with age. The handwriting was neat, the lines carefully written. But the letters had never been sent. There were no stamps or addresses. "Someone wrote these here, for themselves," I whispered, holding one of the fragile letters. Reading the faded words felt like peering into someone else's life, long past. Michael studied the letters intently, as if searching for meaning between the lines. "They're about loss," he said finally. "About someone wrestling with loneliness. There's pain here, but also hope." He sat down on the dusty floor, one of the letters open in front of him, his expression serious. "I've been thinking about writing a book," he admitted. "About people, about how we're all fragile, like glass. But I've never found the right words. Maybe these letters. Maybe they're a start." I sat down beside him. "You could begin with these lines," I said softly. "But the most important thing is to write honestly, from the way you see the world." Michael looked up, and I saw something new in his eyes. Inspiration, a spark of creativity. He nodded slowly. "You're right." His voice was steady. "And thank you for being here." That moment in the lighthouse felt profound. We sat in silence, listening to the waves roaring against the rocks below, and I felt something shift between us. It was as though the old lighthouse, with its forgotten stories, had revealed something meaningful for us as well. The day was gloomy. The sky, heavy with dense gray clouds, seemed to foretell a storm. Michael and I were preparing to head home after a day spent at the lighthouse, but we stopped at an old wooden pier to watch the lake, which was growing more restless with every passing minute. "Rain's coming any second now," Michael observed, his eyes on the horizon, where dark clouds bunched together like ink spilled across paper. "Let's wait it out here," I suggested, pointing to a small shelter at the end of the pier. "It's late to head back anyway." We took refuge under the shelter, its wooden roof groaning under the force of the wind. The lake before us seemed alive, waves rising as if the water was exhaling all its pent-up tension. The wind played with my hair, tossing it across my face. Michael reached out, gently tucking a strand behind my ear, and then he spoke. "This wind, this lake, they remind me of you." I looked at him, startled. "It's hard to explain," he continued with a faint smile. "You seem calm at first glance, but there's this strength inside you. It's magnetic." I felt my heart skip, then race faster. His words unbalanced me. I lowered my gaze, but he gently tilted my face up by my chin. "Why do you always try to hide?" he asked softly. "Because I'm afraid," I began, my voice faltering. "Afraid to let myself feel." "And what scares you more?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice barely audible over the wind and the first drops of rain. "Feeling it or missing it?" In that moment, words lost their meaning. His lips met mine. When he pulled away, I saw in his eyes the same things I felt: uncertainty, hope, and a raw, unspoken desire to stay close. That night, the storm outside mirrored the intensity of what we shared inside. It was a night where walls fell, vulnerability found its voice, and we chose to be present, together. The day was bright and lively, a stark contrast to that stormy night on the pier. In the small village, the annual carnival was in full swing, and Michael had suggested we go. We wandered through rows of stalls selling roasted almonds, cotton candy, and wooden toys. Laughter and music filled the air, and for a moment I felt swept up in the festive whirlwind. "Want to try?" Michael asked, pointing at a shooting gallery where you had to knock down targets. "Think you can do it?" I teased. He accepted the challenge, picked up the rifle, and took aim. The first target fell, then the second. I stood by, laughing as he threw me a proud look after each hit. Finally, after taking down all the targets, he won. The vendor handed him a plush raccoon. "This is for you," Michael said, handing it to me with a smile. "So you'll remember today." "How could I forget?" I replied, hugging the toy close. But the joy of the moment was fleeting. When I looked up, I saw John in the crowd. He stood not far away, his gaze fixed on us. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held pain. Suddenly, the noise of the carnival seemed to fade. Even the vibrant energy around me felt muted. "Caitlin, are you okay?" Michael asked, noticing the sudden pallor on my face. "It's John," I whispered. "He's here." Michael turned and his eyes met John's. It was as if an invisible charge passed between them. After a tense moment, John turned and walked away without a word. My chest tightened with a mixture of shame and guilt. "I need to leave," Michael said quietly but firmly. "I don't want to ruin your life." "Michael," I started, but the words caught in my throat. Anything I could say felt inadequate. He gave me a faint smile, but his eyes brimmed with sadness. "Thank you for everything," he said. "For these days. For showing me that it's okay to feel." Then he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving me standing amidst the noise and lights of the carnival, holding the little raccoon in my hands. Michael was gone. All that remained was silence and a hollow emptiness that clung to me. By evening, I returned home, but the house felt even emptier than before. The boat stood by the shore, a quiet reminder of all the moments we'd shared. On the table in my room lay a photograph, the one Michael had taken that night by the lake. In it, I was staring into the distance, as though searching for answers to questions I couldn't ask. I walked down to the water, and there I found Michael. He was sitting on the shore watching the sunset. In his hands was the notebook we'd found at the lighthouse. "You're still here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up, and in his eyes was something deeper than words could convey. "Wanted to say goodbye," he said. "I'm leaving tomorrow. West Coast. Thinking I'll start with San Francisco." "Is that the right decision?" I asked, sitting down beside him. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "But I feel like if I stay, I'll destroy everything. And I don't want you to lose what you have." We sat in silence, watching the sunset. The water was calm, peaceful, just as it had been the day I arrived. That stillness cut through me, a reminder that everything comes to an end. "You know, I thought coming here would save me," I said, staring at the horizon. But really, I was just avoiding the fact that I couldn't face myself. "You weren't running, Caitlin," he said. "You were searching, and I think you found something, if only for a little while." He smiled, the kind of smile that holds both understanding and goodbye. He pulled a photograph from his bag and handed it to me. "This is for you," he said, "to remind you that once you stopped and saw your true self." I took it, and for a brief moment our fingers touched. That touch was fleeting but profound. "Michael, I began, but he stood up before I could finish. "There's no need," he said gently. "Everything has already been said." And then he walked away, leaving me there by the water. I watched as the sun slowly sank below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that always seemed impossible to me. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words, his gaze, his touch. They swirled in my mind as I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. John returned the next day. I heard the sound of his car at dawn while I stood by the window with a cup of cooling coffee in my hands. He entered the house quietly, as if afraid to disturb me, though his presence alone already filled the space. "How was the trip?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Successful," he replied briefly, setting his backpack in the corner. "But I missed home. I missed you." The words caught me off guard. John had never been one to openly express his emotions. I looked up and saw him watching me intently, as if trying to read what I wasn't ready to say. "Can we talk?" he asked softly. I nodded. We sat on the porch where the lazy breeze played with the curtains. He began. "Caitlin, I know I've missed a lot. I've always been running somewhere. Work, research, and I probably didn't notice when you started pulling away." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I don't want to lose us. If there's a chance to fix things, I want to take it." His words were simple, but they carried a sincerity I hadn't expected. I looked at him, and in that moment, all the memories of Michael and the days we'd spent together surfaced. But with those memories came clarity. What I'd felt with Michael was a glimpse of what I had lost in my relationship with John. "I've missed a lot too," I finally said. I hid behind the quiet, behind this house, hoping things would somehow get better. But instead, we both started living apart from each other. John took my hand. "Can we start over?" he asked. I nodded. We agreed to take a trip, one he'd often mentioned, a small route through the mountains where he wanted to show me places that inspired him. On the road, we talked a lot, about what had gone wrong, about what we had lost and what we could still recover. At one stop, John pulled a small notebook from his backpack. "This is for you," he said, handing it to me. "Write down your thoughts, your impressions. I know you've always loved to write, but somewhere along the way you stopped." The gesture touched me deeply. It wasn't just a gift. It was a first step. His way of showing he saw me, heard me, and recognized that I was still alive and whole. When we returned home, I felt different. Michael had left his mark on my life, reminding me that I was capable of feeling and living fully. But John was the one offering me the chance to not just remember, but to create something new together. That evening, sitting by the lake with the notebook in my hands, I wrote the first lines of a new chapter. They weren't about the past or regrets. They were about how, quietly but resolutely, it was possible to begin again.